Well, welcome back, everyone. Now we're going to focus on one of the most critical skills in academic research, and that is evaluating your research plan. So, a well designed plan is kind of the blueprint that guides your entire study, and it forces you to think about your goals, your methods, the constraints, the ethical responsibilities, all of that before you collect any single data point. And in this course, you're not going to collect the data, but you're going to propose how you would collect the data, and you're going to propose what your research plan would look like. So we're going to go from the theoretical, hopefully, to more of a practical skill set, how to build that research plan, and how to evaluate a research plan. So I'm going to walk you through the six-part structure of what today's lecture is. Um, and these components should mirror the real sections of your research proposal or your document. And we're going to move from conception through design to evaluation. And then hopefully by the end, you'll be ready to evaluate your own research plan. So let's get started, shall we? So, what is a research plan? That's a loaded question. It's sometimes called a research proposal. It's sometimes called a study proposal. It's sometimes called a research design plan. We're calling it a research plan. These are all the same, and it's a blueprint. It's telling the reader step by step what you're going to do, and it's a credible document for others. It's a blueprint for you, and it's showing those reviewing your research what the rigor is, what the feasibility is, and then what the ethical issues and how you're dealing with them. And it's kind of like an alignment. Think about an alignment for your car, right? It's an alignment check. It's a way of asking yourself, do all the pieces of my study connect to one another? So if you look at the slide for the researcher, that's you, it clarifies your thinking before you start collecting data, right? Is this a systematic way that I can conduct the study? It identifies gaps, risks, and assumptions. So it identifies gaps in the literature, the risks or limitations associated with your study, and then assumptions that would occur within your study. And the research plan is going to keep you your scope, right? Think of it as blinders, like, we're going down the path. This is the scope. You don't want to go too far. You don't want to go too narrow. And it's going to keep you on your timeline. For your advisor, for a committee, if you're writing a dissertation, writing a thesis, it shows what you can do in terms of methodology and that you understand how to collect data, how to analyze data. The research plan also, when you're in those situations, gives you feedback early on before you collect the data so that you don't go ahead and do it and you do it wrong and then you can't use your data. And it also allows you to set expectations for what you're going to deliver in terms of maybe it's a curriculum at the end, or maybe it's a paper, or maybe it's a dissertation. And then for IRB, Institutional Review Board, which we are going to talk about, they decide, or they've set the parameters for ethical compliance when it comes to working with human subjects. So there's some very specific things that you're going to learn about. So the research plan tells the IRB that you are following the ethical considerations for working with human subjects. If you were working with funders, it would show you how the resources are being used and how you're allocating those. And probably for everybody across all three of these domains, it really is an accountability framework. It sets up for what you're going to do. So you might want to take a picture of this or a snapshot of this, but these are the 7 parts of all research plans. And depending on your discipline, they may use different terminology, but virtually every research plan across humanities, social sciences, natural sciences use all 7 of these. And the order of these matter: background, research questions, the lit review, the theoretical or conceptual framework, the methodology, the timeline, and resources, and then ethics and limitation. So those 7, if you look at the second column, when you look at background and significance, why this topic matters. What do we already know about it? And you've already set that up in homework 1. The second part are writing your research questions and your hypothesis. Are they specific? Can they be answered? Are they grounded in theory and research? Number 3 is the lit review, right? You're situating in current literature and even in seminal work that we discussed in the previous lecture. Your theoretical or conceptual framework, that's the lens from which you examine your data, and we'll talk about that in another lecture. And then your methodology, how you're going to collect the data, how you're going to decide on your sample, and how you're going to analyze your data. The schedule, is that realistic? Is it within your budget constraints? And then your ethics and limitations. The Institutional Review Board has given you permission to do it. There are no biases, etc. So let's talk about formulating research questions. This is arguably the single most important element of your entire plan. A weak question produces a weak study, no matter how sophisticated the methods are. A strong question that's clear, answerable, significant, can survive method setbacks. So if you look at the quote at the bottom, the engine that drives everything else in your plan, your research question determines everything else that happens. It determines your methods that you'll use, how you'll analyze your data. So it's really important that you nail the research question. It is vitally important that you craft it in a way that it can be answered and that you'll be able to gain valuable data. So when we write research questions, we use SMART criteria. So in education, public health, social sciences, organizational behavior, we can use this in all areas. So something that is probably a pitfall for most students when they begin to write research questions is that they're too broad. So if you look at the S that stands for specific, you want to make sure that it's not so broad that it can't be answered. So the example I have here is, how does education affect society? That's so broad. Who would you study, right? Who's the sample? Who are the people? Who are the participants? But something like, how does class size affect reading achievement in grade 3 students? That's doable, right? You could examine a large class and a small class of third graders and then see if that class size affects or has an impact on reading achievement. Are there other variables? Yes, we're going to talk about that later, but you can see how different those two questions really are. The second SMART goal is measurable. So you have to think about, is it something you can measure quantitatively through numbers or qualitatively through stories, through words, through observations, through artifacts? Is it something that you can collect data? So if you look at my first example, how does education affect society? I'm not sure where I would begin, right? Well, I mean, who am I going to ask? If I want to do semi-structured interviews, let's say I want to do qualitative, where do I begin? In the second example, how does class size affect reading achievement? I could do it qualitatively. I could ask teachers their perceptions. I could ask parents their perceptions. Or I could do it quantitatively and I could look at test scores and I could look at behaviors. I could do surveys of the teachers, of the parents, of administration. So is it measurable? Will data be produced? The third one is, can it be answered? Is it feasible within your time, access to people, access to data, access to resources? So given my time frame, is this something I can do? And can I get access to those people, right? So IRB always says, how are you going to, how are you going to access this sample? And maybe you'll say, I'm going to interview 1,500 teachers. Do you have access to 1,500 teachers? How would that survey go out? Who would be the person sending it? And if it's not you, then who? And do you have permission? Would they do that for you? And there's some steps you would have to go through. Same is true as I want to interview teachers about the use of AI in English class, let's say. Okay, do you know English teachers who are using AI for lesson planning, let's say? Just examples. Okay, the next one is R. Is it relevant? Does it address the gap in the knowledge? Or is it significant? Have you established that in the literature? Which also goes with the T, which is it theoretically grounded? Is it rooted in existing conversations? It's not just coming from anywhere. This is something that the literature is talking about. And look how unique I am in that I'm doing something different with it. This table shows you that the type of question you ask determines your methodology. So that's critical insight that you want to keep in mind. The questions that you ask determine the methodology that you use. So let's look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 types of questions, and then an example question. And then we're going to look at the methodology, the way you would collect that data. So the first one is descriptive. The example is, what is the prevalence of burnout among first-year doctoral students? So descriptive meaning you're going to collect a whole lot of data and it's just going to describe, I shouldn't just say just, it's going to describe the phenomenon. So typically, how would you get that information? Survey, data, observations, or content analysis, which is looking at maybe Facebook groups and you're looking at the content that students are writing and you're analyzing that, or reflective journals. That would be content analysis. So descriptive, what is the prevalence of burnout among first-year doctoral students? The second is comparative. Do burnout rates differ between STEM and humanities doctoral students? So how would you get that information? You could do survey between groups, and you could do a statistical analysis. When you ask a closed question, like do, are, if it's going to give you a yes or no, that is going to be quantitative methods. So you know that you're going to have to do some sort of quantitative methodology when you ask a yes-no question. The third type is relational. Here's my example. How is advisor relationship quality associated with doctoral student burnout? So you could do a regression study, you could do a correlational study, you could do a structural equation modeling, very complex study, but you would have to find a relationship between the doctoral student and their advisor and attribute it to burnout. So you could see how complex that would be, how many variables there are. It would be pretty difficult to do, but doable. The fourth one is a causal question. Does a structured mentorship intervention reduce doctoral student burnout? Notice that is closed. So again, you would use experimental, quasi-experimental, regression. That's going to be quantitative methods. And then interpretive is, how do doctoral students make sense of exhaustion and detachment in their program? How am I going to get that information? Well, I'm going to have to talk to people. And when I talk to people, I know it's going to be qualitative methods. Maybe I use semi-structured interviews. Maybe I use focus groups. Maybe I use observations. But If I'm saying doctoral students how they make sense of something, the only way to get that information is through conversation, and that is to talk to the participants. The participants would be the doctoral students. Now, you've written research questions. Now, let's talk about the lit review. I know we've talked about it. Let's talk about it again. It's kind of misunderstood because you think it's a summary of what you've read. In reality, it's the research plan. It's setting the purpose for the research plan of what you want to do. It's saying why your topic's important, what prior work exists, how your study will fill the gap. It's an argument. It's not a report. So I want you to remember that. When I think about lit reviews, I think about a funnel, an inverted pyramid, where we start very broad and then we go very narrow. So that's why I made it larger down to smaller. So it's not an annotated bibliography. You're synthesizing. You don't want to ignore seminal works if they exist. And you want to make sure you're presenting the most current literature on the topic when you can. So if you look at this slide, the literature review, the first thing it does is it tells us what we already know, right? So you're telling us, here's what we know to date. Here's what I have read and learned, and I'm synthesizing that. You also want to identify anything that is missing, because if you look at the third, that's what you are going to contribute. That's your unique contribution. That's your so what statement. So when people are presenting their doctoral dissertations, I always say to them, so what? Right? So what? Who cares? Well, they care, right? Because their study is going to contribute in some impactful way. Is it going to change the world? No. Is it going to add to the important literature on that topic? Absolutely. Now we're going to look at methodology. Now, I'm going to look at this very broadly at first, and then we're going to get into some more like the nuances of different methodology. This is the blueprint. This is how you're going to answer your research questions, right? This is the how of the study. All right, so I set this up in 4 boxes because I think this is kind of what works best for how I'm going to talk about this. So, methodology. If you look at our research approach, we have 3. Quantitative, that's numbers. That's a hypothesis. And the thing about quantitative studies, they are generalizable to a larger population. Qualitative is more interpretive. It's contextual, right? It's within that context that it matters. And we can say that it's transferable to other contexts, but it's not generalizable to a larger population. A quantitative method might be survey data, quasi-experimental, correlational studies, causal correlational studies. A qualitative methodology would be case study, grounded theory, phenomenology, ethnography. I'm doing these ones off the top of my head. I'm missing one. Those are the stories, right? For instance, let me give you an example. So let's say I'm studying the lived experience of first-generation college students. I'm going to do that qualitatively. The lived experiences, the only way that I can gather data about the lived experiences of first-generation college students is by talking to them. And that's actually, when we talk about lived experience, that's phenomenology. That's qualitative methods. Now, our third type is mixed methods, where you can integrate both. And you can do it one of 2 ways. You can do it sequentially or concurrently. Sequentially means I collected my survey data first, and then I did my interviews or observations. Or vice versa. I did my interviews and observations, and then I'm going to distribute a questionnaire and collect survey data. or you can do it at the same time concurrently, right? So I'm interviewing while this survey is out for distribution. So in your research approach, you're thinking about, do I want to study this quantitatively, qualitatively, or a mixture of both, which is called mixed methods? Remember, like I said earlier, the question that you ask determines the methodology that you use. Okay, so we're going to look at the different designs in each of these, in these methods. So we call them, methods or research approach, and then there's designs, there's types that fall underneath, which we will talk about. All right, next is data collection. So those are the instruments that you're going to use. So surveys, interview protocols, observation guides. Those are the three most popular. Then the other thing we have to worry about are things like validity, reliability of the instruments that you're using. We also have to worry about pilot testing those instruments if they have not been validated. If it's something that the researcher creates, that has to be piloted so that we can collect some data and get some feedback on the instruments. Then we look at sampling strategy. That's who, those are our participants. Those are the people, right? Behind all of this, whether it's words or numbers, it's all people. Whether they're adults or children, it's still people, right? So the sampling strategy, we have three main types. Probability, which is kind of random sampling, right? We're sending it, it's random, right? We're hoping that the right people answer it. Purposeful sampling, where I say, okay, I want to talk to 12th grade English teachers in Pittsburgh Public Schools. I'm very purposeful in choosing them because they're going to be the best informants for my research question. And then we have convenience sampling. So that's like, hey, I have access to these people. It's convenient. I'm going to use them. Below that, if I had a sub, it would be snowball sampling. So sometimes we will purposefully choose samples and then we will say, do you know anybody else who may fit this criteria who may be interested in participating in this study? And then we have to think about our sample size and we have to justify why we've chosen that. In quantitative, we call that power analysis. In qualitative, we call it saturation, when we have interviewed enough people that we're hearing the same thing over and over again, right? So no new data has emerged. And then our fourth square here is the analysis. How we're going to analyze the data that we've collected, what we're going to do if we're missing data, and how we're going to handle that. What's the trustworthiness of that data? What did you do to ensure there was rigor within that study? So typically in qualitative, we are very transparent in what we're doing and how we're collecting the data, analyzing the data, and we share that with our audience, and that adds rigor to the study. So let's talk about feasibility and ethics. Sometimes you underestimate how often studies fail, not because of the bad theory, but because of poor feasibility, poor planning, inadequate ethical consideration. IRB delays alone can derail an entire project. So this section is more about being realistic in what you're doing, so that when you move into the next course, you think strategically about that. All right, so let's talk about feasibility first. So we're going to look at my feasibility checklist. So things you should ask yourself before you do the study. One is access. Do you have access to the participants, to the data, to the research sites? So if you say, I'm going to study leadership qualities of principals in urban schools in Western Pennsylvania. Probably too broad, but let's say, do you have access to those principals? Are they going to be willing to talk to you? Um, that in and of itself is probably the most important thing to think about is, do you have access? And we could all come up with great studies, but the reality is if you can't get your foot in the door, it's not a good study. It's never going to be conducted. Time is the second thing. Can it be completed within your program timeline or within the time that you have? So even in my world, I don't like to carry a study on more than an academic school year. So if I start it in the fall, I like to have it written and published by the summer. So 9 months, I have not done any longitudinal studies. I am going to do a follow-up study here soon on something I did a while back on cheating. And now with the emergence of AI, I'm going to revisit that and maybe even go back to my same participants if I can. I have access to them, so they're now older because the study's old. So think about that. Time, I like it to kind of fit in a box. Third thing are the skills. Do you have the skills to pull this off? Or can you get those skills? Or can you have someone train you? Do you have a mentor that's going to help you? But, you know, um, let's say building a questionnaire, just that in and of itself can be very complex. Distributing is the easy part. Building it can be complex. And do you have the training, or can you get the training, or can you train yourself to do that? Same with interviews. I typically use semi-structured interviews. That can be that can be difficult if you're a talker. You have to be a listener, right? And you got to be a good note taker. So, do you have the skill set? The fourth thing is the budget. Are there any costs involved? So, let's say we're doing interviews, it says transcription software. It used to cost a lot to have transcriptions done. Now that's pretty easy. You can have that done if you do a virtual um, or even if you're doing it in person, you can set up your computer and have it transcribed for you. And then often you just have to go back and double check with the recording and make sure the transcription was correct because, not all transcription programs are created equal. Is there travel? Are you going to offer an incentive? So I think we've all received something in our email before that says like, hey, if you complete the survey, your name will be put in a hat, right? A drawing for $50 Amazon gift card, which I've never won, by the way. So I always think they're lying. But are there incentives? Do you have the budget for that? And there are some ethical considerations when you start talking about giving incentives to people for participating in your study. So that you have to walk a fine line. And then the third thing is a contingency. Let's say you do survey research and the response rate is low. What are you going to do? What if you have 20 participants for interviews or focus groups and 10 of them withdraw? What if you had access to a certain site and all of a sudden that fails? I had access to 3 schools and all 3 principals left, and the new principals are like, no, thank you. So, what's your contingency? What's your backup in case that doesn't happen? And those are things that we're constantly thinking about when we do research. All right, that's kind of the feasibility checklist, like yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. Now let's look at the ethical obligations that you have as a researcher. So the first is the IRB, which is the Institutional Review Board. You have to obtain institutional approval before you can collect data. You are going to do a CITI training, CITI, and you're going to submit that certificate where you go through training on how to ethically um, deal with human subjects when you're doing research. So that is mandatory no matter what university where you're conducting research. The second thing is informed consent. So informed consent is part of the IRB process where you, in writing, are informing participants that they understand the purpose of your research, the risks associated, their ability to withdraw at any time without penalty, how you will, the next thing is how this information will be kept confidential, which means, if it's a survey, it has to be anonymous. If it's interviews or focus groups, I know who you are, but I have to keep you confidential. It has to be anonymous. So maybe I assign a number like your participant one, right? And then how do I store that data so that it's de-identified, no names, and it's protected? And we put that on a password protected um, folder on our computers, and then we get rid of it after 3 to 5 years. It depends on the institution. The fourth thing is the power dynamics, right? So the researcher and participant relationship is really important. For instance, as a professor, and when I ask my students to participate in a study, that is a power dynamic. They may want to do it to make me happy. They may do like teacher pleasing behavior, right? They want to say the right things. So what can I do to eliminate those issues? Well, I deal with them after they graduate. They can be a participant out. The grades are in. You've graduated. I have no, I can't hold anything over your head. Now, I would argue that they still may want to please me and say the right things. And that's a limitation of qualitative research. Sometimes people tell you what they want to hear, what they think you want to hear. The other thing under power dynamics is vulnerable populations. So pregnant women, prisoners, children, right, under 18. There's more, but there are vulnerable populations that extra precautions have to take place when it comes to the ethical considerations with IRB. And then positionality, you have to kind of acknowledge who you are shapes the process and the research that you do. And sometimes that's just being transparent and saying, like, look, I'm a principal, I am a leader. I believe that all leaders should be transformative in their practices, and I'm studying that, so there is a bias. So, evaluating a research plan, um, there's a rubric that we use to do that. And I'm going to share that with you because you may see that rubric again. So I want you to be aware of what that is. And as you're looking at research, use that as a guide to, hey, is this a good um, resource for me to use for my lit review? So when we're looking at research plans, we're looking at the things that we just discussed, the research questions, the lit review, the methodology, the sampling, how data is collected, the feasibility, the rigor, the ethical piece of it. So if you take a moment and just look at the 3-2-1, right, when it looks at research questions, something that's so broad and vague would be weak. That would earn a 1, or something that's very specific and clear and something that's theoretically grounded that can be researched would qualify as a 3. So if you take some time and look at the evaluation rubric and think about that as you're reading research. And I think that's the key piece, that you're now a consumer of research and you can evaluate it based on that rubric. So let me give you some common pitfalls of research plans. And then that's something that you can say, well, I won't do that. So the first thing is like writing research questions like it's the kitchen sink. We call them the kitchen sink questions. And that's like it's one study and you're trying to do way too much. The scope is so large, it's unmanageable, and you really aren't going to find anything that's worth reporting. So what do? You narrow it down. I would rather see one strong question than 3 weak questions. So think about that as you're creating your plan. More questions doesn't mean better. It might actually muddy the water. So strong questions that are doable, right? And that's the key. Can you do them? The second pitfall is the method before the question. So people love to choose their methodology when the reality is that the question should drive the method, right? The question determines the methodology. If I ask, do Keystone scores determine XYZ? I can't even think of anything. I'm asking do. That's a yes, no. Well, it wouldn't be qualitative. It would definitely be quantitative. If I asked, how do first-year teachers describe the obstacles that they faced, that would be qualitative. How do I know? I'm going to have to ask the first-year teachers. The third pitfall is literature as decoration. So, you're just citing sources without actually synthesizing anything. You're just citing. So make sure that every citation has a purpose and you're just not filling space on the page, right? And they're timely within the last 5 years unless they're seminal work. The fourth pitfall is like, it's feasible, but is it? So you got to think about the what ifs. What if it doesn't happen? So the survey response rate is probably the biggest pitfall that people fall into. They think that people want to answer or want to respond to their survey. They don't. A 30% response rate is phenomenal. You're never going to see an 80%. And remember, the population has to be large. So out of 100 people, you think 80 people are going to answer? Most likely not. So being overly optimistic, so talk to people, see what other people have done. If you don't have access, it would be silly to go down a line of inquiry or a line of methodology that's just not feasible for you. And then the last thing is ethics. It's not an afterthought. You have to think about who could be harmed, what protections you will put in place. You have to do your city training and you have to submit IRB before you could do any research. And that's in schools, universities, hospitals. So keep that in mind. And sometimes IRB is a multi-step process, like it gets denied a couple times. So it's not like a one and done. You're sitting around waiting for them to approve you. All right, so you've been sitting long enough. So what do I want you to take away? I want you to take away that the research plan's an argument, right? Every section is going to kind of build this case for why this study is so important, why it's doable, why we have to have it. Your research questions drive everything. Your method, your sampling, your analysis, that comes after. You've got to get the question right. So that's why meet with me, talk to me, have conversations so we can get the question right before you make the plan. The third thing is make sure you remember that the literature review positions you in this conversation in a scholarly way, and that you're looking for a gap and you're building that gap. Maybe there's been a ton of work done in phonics, systematic phonics instruction. Yeah, we know, okay, yes, this is all good stuff, all the argument. But what's missing? Right? Who hasn't been examined yet? Is there a population? What hasn't been examined yet within phonics instruction? What's missing from the conversation? You have to sit back, you got to think about it, and you have to read the literature. Number 4, methodology must be justified, not just described. You have to explain why you've chosen that and justify to the reader why you've chosen that methodology, because that is the best way to examine this. Next is feasibility and ethics. We're not just checking a box. These are things that you have to do. It's important that you protect your participants, and it's the law. And then last, take that rubric, look at other research plans and evaluate them, or look at articles and evaluate them and see, like, does this stand out? Does it bubble to the top? Does it get all 3s? You're going to be creating a research plan, so I want you to start feeling comfortable thinking in those terms. All right. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it, and I will see you soon. Bye bye.